Well, welcome to our in-house crowd at the Museum of the American Revolution, and like 40 people are actually watching on Zoom tonight from across the nation: California, Montana, New Hampshire, I believe, Maryland, I don't know, maybe Florida, at least, are the ones I remember. So thanks to all of you who are tuning in tonight. It wasn't that cold, so those of you in the, close by could have come in, like these stalwart folks who've joined us in Liberty Hall here at the Museum of the American Revolution. I am very excited for this next installment of our Read the Revolution series with Dr. Michael D. Hattem. A little bit more about him in just a minute after I share a few updates and exciting things that are on the way. I want to start off by thanking the sponsor of this series, the Haverford Trust Company. David Papard, where are you? There you are in the back. Thank you. Haverford have been supporting the museum since before we even cut the ribbon and opened the museum, and longtime supporters of many of the activities here, and particularly our Read the Revolution series. And so we're very grateful for those many years of support and for your friendship, David. You are no stranger to us here. For those, I often will say the incentive to get off your couch, people on the live stream here, and come into the museum is we always pull out a few cool things out of the collection. Typically museums have no more than 10% of the objects that are in the collection that are actually out on display at any given time. So we have always got really neat stuff that does not necessarily see the light of day all the time. So we've got some wonderful ribbons from a Revolutionary War veteran, a reverend, who actually fought at the Battle of Bunker Hill and was at the fight at Concord Bridge on April 19th of 1775, and a wonderful beer tray from Valley Forge as well. That's one of my favorite objects in the collection because I'm a big fan of beer. Speaking of April 19th, April 19th of 2025 is the 250th anniversary of the shot heard round the world, the battles of Lexington and Concord. You're hearing a lot about the nation's 250th and 2026, and that's super important. But there was a lot of things that happened in the year leading up to American independence. We are celebrating that 250th anniversary with the opening of Banners of Liberty, which is an exhibition of original Revolutionary War flags. Now, there are only about 30 American flags carried during our War for Independence that have survived to the present day. And we have half of those that are going to be in the building here from April 19th to August 10th. Now, you would literally have had to have been alive in 1783 to see this many together. This was not done during the American Centennial. Was it the semi-quincentennial? What was 1926? The sesqua. Nobody takes Latin anymore, apparently, except the old guys up here. So anyway, needless to say, for those of you of a certain age who remember the King Tut exhibit, right? You had to see King Tut even if you didn't care about Steve Martin, right? And, King. This is the King Tut version of the American Revolution. So you will have to be here to see Banners of Liberty. This is an opportunity to thank, first of all of you who are members of the museum. Will you raise your hands if you are members of the museum? Excellent. Thank you very much. Those who are tuning in, you can use the little hand gesture on Zoom to let us know. If not, shame on you if you're not a member. You should become a member because you will be invited to a lot of great events, some preview events. Our associate curator, Jim Taub, over here, we love him very much, new member of the team, is going to do a sneak peek virtual event. That's on January 30th to kind of give you a little sneak peek of what's coming, a little preview of the exhibition. February 18th, you'll have a chance to come back here to the museum. Jeff Bridgman is probably the preeminent scholar and collector and dealer in historic American antique flags. And Jeff's going to come for a conversation with me. If you can't make it to the museum, it is a hybrid event, so you can tune in as well. Those of you who have been with us for a few years, you might remember we've done 2 previous summer exhibitions of historic flags. And a lot of those have come either from Jeff's personal collection or his connections to all of the collectors out there. And so he's also a supporter and very excited about our Banners of Liberty exhibition. But that brings me to the reason for the season, which is this wonderful book, which I got to tell you, I'm going to say this several times tonight, I absolutely loved reading The Memory of 76. You're nodding vigorously. This is an incredible book, and I do not oversell and underpromise, I promise you. And particularly important as we are entering the season of these anniversaries that are coming up, 2025, 2026, and really be the beginning of 8 years of anniversaries commemorating the American War for Independence, the American Revolution. And so I'm really looking forward to the conversation tonight with some remarks from Dr. Michael Hattem, who has his PhD from Yale University and is a scholar of early America, revolutionary America, historical memory. His first book, of course, exploring memory in the revolution itself and how that revolutionary generation kind of thought about history and the role that that played in the formation of the nation. And now just timed perfectly for the moment that we're in as a country, reflecting on how all of those subsequent generations have remembered the revolution, the uses that they have tried to advance their present-minded causes by reaching back to the Revolutionary era. So after some preparatory remarks and kind of a précis of the book, we'll have a little conversation, and then we're looking forward to your comments. Those of you who are tuning in online, feel free, first of all, to have a little church on there and share with each other your thoughts. Throw some questions out there because we'll have a mic runner, but we're happy to throw a few of your questions to Dr. Hattem. And we'll also, of course, pass the microphone around here. So without further ado, will you please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael D. Hattem. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, everyone, for coming. Let's see. I'm going to begin right away with a story that I first came across in the archives of the Maine Historical Society nearly a decade ago. This is Eliza Wadsworth. She was a 20-year-old woman living in Portland, Maine. And in January 1800, having been so moved by the death of George Washington, she asked her father, Peleg Wadsworth, who had been a Continental Army officer and was serving in Congress in Philadelphia, for a memento of the Revolutionary hero. A scrap of General Washington's handwriting, perhaps his name, she asked her father for, but then she went a step further and asked, had he hair? Well, Peleg's deep affection for his daughter prompted him to write to Martha Washington and to enclose Eliza's letter. 2 weeks later, he received a reply from Tobias Lear, who was the Washington's personal secretary. And he wrote, "The ardent wish expressed by your daughter has induced Mrs. Washington to comply with the request by sending the lock of hair I now have the honor to enclose." Now, shortly after, Eliza received a package in the mail from her father, and inside were 2 envelopes, one marked, "Read this first." And in that envelope, a letter from Peleg read, "You expressed a strong wish for some relic of General Washington. I will not detain you longer, but leave you to unfold the secret." Eliza described what happened next. She wrote, "When I opened the sacred paper with veneration and awe, I could not even shed a tear for so invaluable a gift. How shall I duly honor the relic?" she wrote. "I feel as if it was too great for me to possess. I want to give thousands who've never had the happiness of seeing George Washington the satisfaction of viewing this lock. I am singularly happy." But Eliza's health was unstable, and just 2 years later, she died from tuberculosis at the age of 22, and her letters and the lock of hair were preserved within her family. Her sister later passed them down to her son, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who ultimately donated them to the Maine Historical Society, where they remain today. Now, Eliza's story is about more than just a young woman and a lock of hair. It is emblematic of the deeply emotional connection that Americans have had with the memory of the American Revolution that really began in the early 19th century and has continued generation after generation throughout American history. And so in my talk tonight, I want to explore and examine this phenomenon, this unique emotional relationship that Americans have had with their revolution for nearly 250 years. Now, the memory of the American Revolution is our national origin myth. Historians typically use the term myth in a rather simplistic way to mean a widely held misconception or an inaccurate or exaggerated story. But the primary definition of a myth, particularly an origin myth, is a story that explains how a society or a people came to be, a story that defines the character of that society and its people, and that in some way expresses a vision of the future. So to talk about mythologizing the revolution is not to tell inaccurate or exaggerated stories about it, but it's really to tell the story of the revolution in a way that explains the origins of the nation, how the United States came to be, to define its character, and also to express a vision or an agenda for the nation's future. And so I want to really explore what it means that we have mythologized the meaning, mythologized the revolution, and how that has worked in practice, and then what it tells us about Americans' relationship to the revolution. Now, myths are first and foremost stories, right? And like so many good stories, the tale of the American Revolution has often been told in 3 acts. The first act focuses on the coming of the revolution, and it features a succession of famous pieces of legislation and events: the Stamp Act, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, etc. The second act typically features the war and is structured around a timeline of famous battles, right? Brooklyn, Trenton, Saratoga, Yorktown. And then the third and final act typically recounts how in the 1780s the weakness of the Articles of Confederation really lead to the Constitutional Convention and ultimately the culmination of the revolution with the Constitution. And so this way of telling the story of the revolution has a sort of logical beginning, middle, and end, and it imbues the telling of the revolution with a sort of inherent literary quality. But if we go a bit deeper, we find that the ways that Americans have told this basic story of the revolution has really followed a familiar form. The hero's journey is a common narrative structure in Western mythology that was first identified by Joseph Campbell in the mid-20th century. And put simply, it's a sort of sequence of commonly recurring plot points that Campbell found in his studies of many hero myths. In the 20th and 21st centuries, this story structure has been used by writers and filmmakers, many of whom were explicitly influenced by Campbell's work, in such iconic products of popular culture as Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, The Matrix, and many others. And so I'm going to suggest to you tonight that how Americans have told the story of the revolution for nearly 250 years has roughly followed this traditional Western mythic narrative structure. So at the start of the hero's journey, the hero, or in our case, the revolutionary generation, receives a call to adventure. And after a number of attempts in the 1760s by the British Empire to exert greater control over its colonies, in 1774, Parliament passes the infamous Coercive Acts in retaliation for the Tea Party, and this unprecedented attack on colonial self-government causes colonists to create a Continental Congress. Now, typically in the story, the hero initially refuses the call to adventure, and of course, throughout 1774 and 75, Congress refuses to consider independence and instead focuses on trying to reconcile with Britain. But eventually, the hero accepts the call and sets off on the adventure by crossing the threshold into the unknown world. And of course, in July 1776, the revolutionaries accept the call to adventure by declaring independence and crossing the threshold into the unknown world of independence and war. Now, the hero then typically undergoes a series of challenges and temptations. And for the revolution, these challenges are represented by many of the war's battles. And though they're rooted in actual history, some of the war's most famous stories have really been told in mythical ways. If we think about the Continental Army's daring escape after the Battle of Brooklyn, right, where Washington engineers the crossing of his entire army in one night under the cover of darkness and a sort of opportune fog. There's also the successful attack on Trenton on Christmas Day, 1776, which is mythically depicted in Emanuel Leitz's famous 1851 painting. These tales, though they're rooted in actual history, have lent themselves well to the mythologizing of the revolution, and they've been told and retold for 200 years or more in ways that sort of lend them mythical connotations. Now, often early in the journey, the hero receives the guidance from a mentor, and later receives the timely aid of a helper. And for the revolutionaries, the helper was, of course, France. And like the many times in mythical stories and folk tales when the helper shows up at just the right moment to make victory possible, the French fleet arrives at the Chesapeake Bay from the Caribbean just in time to surround Cornwallis's British army and make the siege of Yorktown possible in 1781. And that effectively ends the war and secures American independence. Now, as a result of the adventure, the hero often undergoes a process of revelation and rebirth. And in our story, the revelation of having secured independence leads the former British subjects to be reborn as American citizens. They then undergo a transformation into a new confederation of states. But as they quickly come to realize that the new government is not working, they reach the moment of atonement and call a constitutional convention in 1787. And once the atonement is complete, they receive the gift of the goddess, you guessed it, and return to the known world, which is now changed for the better. Now, this mythologizing of the memory of the revolution has historically provided a nation that is still relatively young with an epic, mythical past replete with heroes and villains and peril and daring escapes aided by a seemingly enchanted natural world, and meaningful revelations about how the world or the nation should be. And many generations of Americans who have encountered this narrative of the revolution, I think especially in the 19th century, have had emotional experiences akin to those that modern audiences have had to Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, or Harry Potter. And this way of telling the story has lent the popular memory of the revolution a sort of implicit weight that is laden with meaning, purpose, and destiny that it gives to the American identity for more than 2 centuries. Now, because of its prevalence and its longevity in Western culture, we are sort of culturally hardwired in such a way that this story structure elicits intense emotional responses. And that the story of the revolution has been told like this, I think helps us better understand Americans' unusual emotional connection to the revolution. These kinds of stories kindle these intense emotional connections in part because they're usually intended to foster one's sense of belonging to a community. And we can see this actually in a field of study known as fandom studies, or the study of fan culture. Fandom studies explores how people and groups relate to these kinds of stories and other facets of popular culture, how they express their connections to those stories, and how those connections influence their personal identities and lead them to form communities with fellow fans. So one of the most common ways that fans do these things is through conventions, right? Annual events where people who share a love of these stories or a specific story gather to discuss and express their connections to them. And of course, Americans do the same for the American Revolution in some sense every July 4th, every time they visit places like Mount Vernon, Independence Hall, the Boston Freedom Trail. Another way that fans express their emotional connection to stories is by engaging in cosplay, where they dress up as their favorite characters. And of course, Americans have a long tradition of reenacting in full costume Revolutionary War battles or moments like the crossing of the Delaware. Still another way that fans express their emotional connections to stories is through fan fiction, right? And there are whole websites devoted to fans writing their own stories featuring the characters of Star Wars or Harry Potter. This one has 637 stories alone, just this one website. And of course, Americans have done this too by creating and reading historical fiction, right? That is, stories set in the Revolutionary era that often feature real-life characters. And one of the most popular of these in the 20th century was Johnny Tremaine. Another way that fans engage with stories is through fan art, where they create artwork that depicts famous scenes from the stories and beloved characters. And we might think of Trumbull and Leutz's famous paintings as fan art of the American Revolution. One final way I'll mention is that fans visit recreations of the worlds of their stories. So fans of Harry Potter can go to Universal Studios and walk down Diagon Alley. Fans of Lord of the Rings can go to New Zealand and visit the set of the Shire. And people visit them because they want to inhabit the stories that they have emotional connections to. And this is the same reason that many people have long visited places like Colonial Williamsburg, right, the Boston Freedom Trail, or even Independence National Historical Park. So we can see that there are similarities between fan cultures and the ways that Americans have celebrated or commemorated the American Revolution. And these fan cultures arise when stories take hold of people's imaginations, and they establish such a deep emotional connection to those stories that they go on to form a part of their personal identity and inspire them to become part of a sort of shared community. And this is a very similar dynamic that plays out with the memory of the American Revolution in American culture over the last 200 years. And so I would suggest that part of the power of the memory of the Revolution comes in no small part because it is an origin myth that's told in the form of a hero myth. And this has contributed to Americans' unique emotional connection to the memory of the Revolution. And it also reminds us of the importance of how we tell the story of the Revolution, which of course is an endeavor that this institution is engaged on a daily basis. But what Americans over the last quarter of a millennium have done with that emotional connection, what principles they've found in the Revolution or used the Revolution to justify, has varied as widely as the political spectrum. And that is because even within the general structure that I laid out here, Americans have always selectively emphasized or ignored certain parts of the story or certain people to attribute a specific character or meaning to the Revolution. And there are, of course, many ways of subtly changing the meaning of the Revolution within that structure. Something as simple as shifting the start date of the Revolution can have a great effect on the meaning that's conveyed, right? If to tell the story of the Revolution as starting in 1765 with the Stamp Act prioritizes the role of British legislation in pushing the colonies towards independence. Or if you tell the story of the Revolution starting with Lexington and Concord, like many in the revolutionary generation understood it as having been started in 1775, that in some sense defines the Revolution primarily as a military event, right? One can argue that the Revolution ended in 1783 with the end of the war, or you can argue that it ended in 1788 with the ratification of the Constitution, and that can convey that the Constitution was the culmination of the Revolution. And that specific narrative itself can be either triumphal or it can be a tragedy. Many historians have argued that the Constitution was actually a counter-revolution by elites against the rising force of democracy that the Revolution unleashed. All of these narratives go on to form what I call popular memories. And popular memory is basically a widely accepted story or narrative about the past that's told in such a way to attribute a specific meaning to it. And the meanings that we attribute to historical events, and specifically the Revolution, typically reflect our own times and are intended to justify previously held beliefs. How we talk about the Revolution often reveals far more about the present than the past, and far more about us than the Revolution. And as my book shows, the Americans have interpreted the Revolution and its meaning in many different and often directly conflicting ways. And so, in other words, there is no single correct meaning or interpretation of the Revolution. And as a national origin myth, its popular memory has been constantly contested And that is really the core of the book, is about these many fights over the last 250 years about what the revolution means. And I want to give you an example of that from the early to mid 19th century. For much of the nation's first 50 years, the Declaration of Independence primarily symbolized independence from Britain and the union of the states. And for that reason, the most important part of it was the grievances and the final paragraph, not the preamble with its universal statement of rights and equality. And that only really began to change in the 1830s with the rise of abolitionism. In fact, it was the abolitionist movement that created the modern memory of the Declaration of Independence as defined by the preamble, the principles of liberty and equality, rather than independence and union. Abolitionist writers and orators repeatedly mentioned the Declaration, including notably here in the first issue of The Liberator in 1831. Introducing the new publication, William Lloyd Garrison explains the symbolism behind publishing the newspaper in Boston, where he says, "I determined at every hazard to lift up the standard of emancipation in the eyes of the nation within sight of Bunker Hill and in the birthplace of liberty." Abolitionists meeting in Vermont passed a resolution stating slavery in 1833 is incompatible with the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And in 1839, the Old Colony Anti-Slavery Society in Plymouth, Massachusetts, resolved that the Declaration was, quote, the fundamental document of our national existence. In other words, the abolitionists defined the Declaration by the principle of equality, and they defined the Revolution by the Declaration. But that did not escape the notice of Southerners. In a newspaper in South Carolina in 1835, one pro-slavery writer dismissed the phrase, all men are created equal, as merely a, quote, rhetorical flourish, and claimed that it was to blame for, quote, the wild theories of liberty held by so many. Now, in the hands of abolitionists, Southerners claimed that the Declaration had become, quote, a very seditious instrument. And for them, the Constitution, which protected slavery, was the fundamental or defining document of the Revolution, not the Declaration. And so, in some sense, this sets the stage for a sort of tension that would run throughout the rest of the history of the memory of the Revolution, which is between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. To have two fundamental founding documents that are fundamentally different, right? The Radical Declaration with its pronouncements of liberty and equality, or the Constitution, which established and maintained order, and in the case of the 19th century, slavery. And so abolitionists and pro-slavery Southerners fought over which document defined the Revolution, and by extension defined the nation. In some sense, those who opposed slavery hoped that the Declaration would save the nation from slavery, while many Southerners hoped that the Constitution would continue to save slavery from the Declaration. And this conflict are rooted in this theme that runs throughout the history of the memory of the Revolution between these two founding documents. Now, this is just one of many examples in the book of sort of political and partisan conflicts over the memory of the Revolution, but I want to give you also briefly a sense of how foreign affairs and geopolitics can influence how the memory of the Revolution is remembered. In the 1930s, the German-American Bund was an American pro-Nazi group led by German immigrants who used the memory of the Revolution with some success. The Bund's goal was to oppose American intervention into the war in Europe. And Washington was a popular symbol for the Bund because of his farewell address, which famously called on future generations of Americans to stay out of European wars. And on the evening of February 20th, 1939, the Bund held a pro-American rally at the old Madison Square Garden in New York City to commemorate Washington's birthday. More than 15,000 people attended this rally, where the stage featured an imposing backdrop with a 30-foot full-length image of George Washington, flanked on both sides by 1776 flags and swastikas. The speakers warned that as more Americans favored entering World War II, quote, we are utterly and completely disregarding the admonition of George Washington. And ultimately, the Bund tried to convince Americans that Nazism was a continuation of the American Revolution, and a not insignificant number of Americans were persuaded. And I'll give you one more example in closing of international politics affecting the memory of the revolution, and this is one of my favorite stories from the book. This is Robert Goldstein. He was a Jewish German-American costumer in Los Angeles in the 1910s. And after the success of D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation in 1915, he became convinced that a similar large-scale historical epic film about the American Revolution could be just as successful. So he raised a large amount of funding for what would be the first full-length feature film about the American Revolution, which he wrote, directed, and produced himself. His film, The Spirit of 76, debuted in Chicago in May of 1917, 1 month after the U.S. had officially joined the war against Germany with its new ally, Great Britain. Now, throughout the 19th century, Great Britain had played the role of evil villain in the popular memory of the Revolution. But relations between the two countries became much more friendly around the turn of the 20th century. Now, in attendance at this pre-screening were some critics and the city's controversial police censor board. Even though one critic described the film as patriotic, the head of the censor board, this man, Major Metellus Lucullus Cicero Funkhauser, he disagreed. He objected to scenes in the movie that showed British atrocities, arguing that they would, quote, arouse bitterness and sectional feeling against England, now one of the United States allies in the present war. And so Funkhauser seized the film and called the Justice Department. And eventually, Goldstein was allowed to show the film so long as he deleted the offending scenes. Now, we don't know why, but before the film premiered in Los Angeles in November of 1917, Goldstein restored the deleted scenes. He was arrested immediately after the premiere and charged under the Espionage Act, which had been passed just a few months earlier to crack down on public dissent against the war. Bail was set at $10,000, and the LA Times ran the headline, "War of Revolution Film Seized by Government." The case went to trial, and it was presided over by Judge Benjamin Franklin Bledsoe. And the media reported on this trial all kinds of unfounded rumors that Goldstein was a German agent. They called the film German propaganda. And ultimately, Goldstein was found guilty and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison and a $5,000 fine. He was released from prison early in 1921, and after a sort of unsuccessful attempt to revive the film, he had to leave the United States for Europe in search of work. He sort of last turns up in the historical record in Nazi Germany in 1935, where he was arrested in Berlin for being unable to afford to renew his passport. Now, this story is an example of how the politics of the times shapes the way we remember the revolution. Goldstein thought he was making a patriotic film, right? He was making a film based on a memory of the revolution that he had learned when he was younger, in which Great Britain was the evil enemy. His great tragedy, in some sense, is that he was too slow to realize that the memory of the revolution was changing rapidly because of the war, and that the old memory of the revolution had not only become outdated, but legally treasonous. Now, if he had released that film a few years earlier or a few years later, things likely would have turned out very differently. But instead, Goldstein was imprisoned as a traitor for making the first feature film about the American Revolution. And that film is lost to time because no copy of The Spirit of 76 has ever been found. And so I want to conclude by arguing, basically, that the memory of the revolution has effectively served as a vehicle of expression. It's basically provided us with a shared political language that has mediated and helped shape many of our most divisive and hard-fought political conflicts. And of course, like with regular language, the terms that we use, they can mean different things to different people, and their meanings can change over time. And so for nearly 250 years, we have used that language to express our political beliefs in the present and to express our visions of the future. Ultimately, it is part of our birthright and our civic duty as American citizens to determine what the revolution means to us. And as a result of that, we have always embedded in our memories of the revolution our grandest dreams and our highest aspirations, as well as our deepest fears and our ugliest prejudices. When we look at the revolution, we are effectively looking into a mirror. We see ourselves in the revolution, and we see the revolution in ourselves. The revolution is always in the eye of the beholder, and though many may claim sole ownership of it, in a democracy, no one owns the past, right? The memory of the revolution belongs to each and every one of us to make of it what we will, for better and worse. Thank you.
Shall we? Well, Michael, I think one of the great things, the richness of the book is when I started into the book, I was reminded of my graduate school advisor, the late Stephen Innes at the University of Virginia, whose revolution course, his undergraduate revolution course, the final exam, there was just one question. He had two quotes. One was from John Adams, saying the American Revolution happened before the war. It was a change in the transformation of the hearts and minds of the people. And then our own beloved Benjamin Rush, no stranger to all the people in the audience here, who says the American war is over. But this is not the case with the American Revolution. Only the first act of the great drama is over. And then the final exam was discuss. This is back in the days of the Blue Book, when you actually you did not have Chat GPT. You could not, write your essay. And so I think just, maybe if we can, before we invite some questions, I'd like to just pull up a few moments along the journey, the 250-year journey of remembering the revolution. And because we are in the bicentennial year of Lafayette's return and the sort of, the passing of the older revolutionaries, Adams, Jefferson, Charles Carroll being left as the sole signer there. Could you just talk a little bit about sort of that debate and discussion that was going on, even among those who had made and witnessed the revolution, about what they meant when they used the term American Revolution?
I mean, it's important to remember that the founding generation themselves did not agree on what the revolution meant, right? We wouldn't have had the first party system if that was the case in the 1790s. But the Jubilee of 1826 is how they referred to it. That comes on the heels of the War of 1812. So there's a great rush of patriotism. There is a great sort of sense of reminding of the importance of the revolution as a new generation went through their own war with Great Britain. And then the so-called sort of era of good feelings, right? So there's a sort of decline in partisanship as the Federalist Party sort of stops really being a thing. But one of the most important things that happens, I think, in the lead up to the anniversary of 1826 is the way that Continental Army soldiers started to become part of the popular memory of the Revolution. And this happens partly because of the Pension Act of 1819, which granted a pension to Continental Army soldiers specifically. And as part of their applications to receive their pensions, they had to write a record of their service. And those accounts are held at the National Archives still. But they started to become local celebrities. Their accounts were published in newspapers and things like that. And then, of course, when Lafayette comes in 1824 for his sort of national tour, everywhere he goes, Continental Army veterans are given a pride of place in the events. And so they gain a sort of new prominence in the popular memory of the Revolution that did not exist before. It can be easy to think, or it can be hard to understand how Continental Army soldiers were not celebrated, before the 1820s, because they were seen as having come from what they would say the dregs of society, right? They were young men or old men, and the really responsible Republican citizens came from fought in the militias, right? And so they were not really celebrated at all until the 1820s, when there was a sort of a growing sense that they were dying out. But then also, of course, the Pension Act in Lafayette. And so in a lot of ways, to me, 1826, that anniversary is marked by the prominence of these veterans, and partly because the long-term significance of that is it's the beginning of a democratization of the story of the revolution, of the memory of the revolution, by including these common ordinary men who served in the Continental Army, rather than just a story about elite heroes, which is what it had been, since certainly since Mason Weems' biography of George Washington, 1800, and that began a process that continues down to this present day of consistently trying to expand the cast of characters of the revolution and who gets included in the story of the revolution, right? And that is, of course, that is at the heart of the mission of this institution. And so that really places, this institution at the head of a very long tradition in the memory of the revolution that goes back over 200 years.
Yeah, I think you do such a great job in the book of talking about William Cooper Nell, and just the I think for those who don't have a deep grounding in the sort of historiography of the revolution, the assumption might be it was, say, the 1960s, 1970s when, for instance, the paying attention to patriots of color began. But actually, it's much earlier. Could you talk a little bit about the remarkable?
Yeah. So that comes on the heels of the Jubilee, right? So in the 1830s, 1840s, the abolitionist movement is in part responsible for that. William Cooper Nell was this free African American abolitionist in Boston, and he worked for Garrison's Liberator at one point. And in the 1840s, he started researching the role and the contributions of black regiments in the Continental Army and in the Revolution, and eventually published a pamphlet in 1848, and then in 1850 a book called Colored Patriots of the American Revolution, which is really the first history of African Americans and in the Revolution. And then, of course, at that exact same time, a woman named Elizabeth Elliot in New York, a divorced woman who ran in literary circles, was researching the lives of the wives of certain revolutionary heroes, typically. And that book was eventually published in 2 volumes in 1848 as The Women of the American Revolution, and it was hugely popular, went through many editions. And so, these efforts go back to well over 150 years or more, and both of those are tied to specific social movements, right? In Nell's case, it's the abolitionist movement that spurs that research, and he's also the one who's responsible for bringing Crispus Attucks, from the Boston Massacre, for bringing him into the popular memory of the revolution. And in Elliott's case, the women's rights movements that resulted in the Seneca Falls Declaration in 1848 also spurred her research. So this is a long tradition in the memory of the revolution of trying to create a more inclusive narrative and a more inclusive memory.
Can you talk a little bit about, as we get in then to sort of the 1850s and the sectional crisis coming to a head, sort of how do the battle lines form, so to speak, around claiming the revolution and who's emphasizing what?
Yeah. So, I allude to a little bit, in talking about the abolitionists and Southerners. It really does split. The section of the book is called Sectionalizing the Revolution. And basically, the revolution for Southerners means the Constitution because it's protecting slavery. And for Northerners, it's certainly Northern abolitionists. The revolution is defined by the Declaration of Independence. And this conflict, this really comes to a head, of course, in the Civil War. But something interesting happens in which there are when the South succeeds from the Union, Southerners had to, in some sense, disown the memory of the Revolution, right? If we think of Alexander Stephens' famous Cornerstone speech where he says the Declaration is wrong, right? He's disowning the Declaration, and Jefferson and the founders and all of them saying they were wrong, white supremacy is right, you know? But even their connection to the Constitution comes under, you know, significant question. And, you know, I write in the book about how there are many Southern writers in the 1860s who are, and in the lead up to secession, who are arguing that, you know, the Constitution was never meant to be permanent. It was never meant to be perpetual. And that they would argue that the founders always meant that states could leave whenever they wanted. So they're sort of reimagining the Constitution in a way that makes there sort of no need for the Constitution, right? But then, of course, when they create the Confederate Constitution, it looks very much like the American Constitution, except it explicitly protects slavery, right? So Southerners end up having this really complicated relationship with the Revolution, the memory of the Revolution, and coming back to that is a process that takes many decades, you know, and was, I argue in the book, you know, a part of the process of the South being reintegrated into the nation after the war and Reconstruction.
So how do they use that as glue after it had been scissors for a few years?
Yeah, I mean, in the book, I have a section called "Nationalizing the Revolution," and there is a sense in the late 1870s, 1880s, 1890s about, you know, how do we use the memory of the Revolution to bring the nation back together, to make the South feel like Americans again, to make the Northerners forget about secession and the Civil War. And one of the interesting ways that I found that I talk about in the book is was actually the Liberty Bell. The Liberty Bell goes on a number of tours throughout the country. In the late 19th century, it goes to St. Louis. It goes to New Orleans. Many locations in the South. Who in the late 19th century, there would be requests made to the city about, you know, sending the Liberty Bell, and this was done a number of times.
Museums do that all the time now. We have to borrow treasures, yes,
but not the Liberty Bell, right?
No.
Because it went on its last tour in 1915, and this was a cross country tour that it went on a special train that was called the Liberty Special, and the bell was on a car. An open car that was illuminated so you could see it, pass by. And it went all through the Midwest, up into Washington State, and then down the coast because its destination was the Panama Pacific International Exposition. It was like a World's Fair in San Francisco. And people came from all around to see the Liberty Bell pass by. There's lots of accounts in local newspapers that I found of people who, stories of, you know, people walking miles barefoot just to see the Liberty Bell pass by, not even for a stop, you know. It would stop in certain towns maybe for 10 minutes, maybe for an hour or two, and for a little bit more in bigger cities. But this tour of the Liberty Bell was a national event, you know. It was and it was a chance for people, first in the Midwest and the West, to have some kind of direct, tangible experience with the Revolution, right? They're very geographically removed from that. And then the bell on its way back to Philadelphia goes down through the Southwest and the Deep South. And I write in the book, there's an incident in Texas where a young African-American girl goes up and kisses the bell, which was very common on this tour, and basically set off a riot, you know. So, again, when I say, you know, our greatest aspirations and our deepest prejudices, you know, you see that reflected in that tour of the Liberty Bell. But it's this attempt to try to use a symbol of the revolution to try to make Americans forget about all this conflict that had happened and feel a part of the same thing, feel a part of the same community.
So getting into sort of the period of mass immigration, getting into the progressive era. I think this is the point where something that begins to feel like a recognizable sort of liberal conservative split and trying to really use and claim the revolution, starts to feel recognizable to all of us. Can you talk a little bit about that transition?
Yeah, so this is in the early 20th century, sort of after this period of nationalizing is over, and there emerges in the early 20th century in efforts to sort of modernize the memory of the revolution, two really distinct ways of thinking about the revolution. Sort of one progressive way, and these are like the progressives we think of, like Woodrow Wilson and others like that, who understood the revolution, or specifically the Constitution, as they came up with the doctrine of the living Constitution. Right, this idea that the Constitution and the nation needs to adapt to this is a new modern world in the new 20th century, and the nation needs to adapt to it. And in that sense, they're very much in the vein of the abolitionists who treated the revolution as if it was ongoing. They would talk about the unfinished revolution, right? The revolution is never over, right? The revolution is a process. It wasn't an event. But the conservative...
We still have that messaging challenge here at the Museum of the American Revolution.
Well, I mean, both of these ways of thinking about it are still very prevalent. The conservative response to that was, to create a very celebratory type of memory of the revolution and form of patriotism, really. That was about... the idea was the revolution was this great thing that had happened in the past, and the way that you honor it is basically by celebrating it, right, and not treating it very critically, right, and that's really it. And there's a very famous book written in 1913, which is Charles Beard's economic interpretation of the Constitution, where he argues that the founders basically voted in the Constitutional Convention based on what their financial interests were, right? And this book is an academic book, but it was scandalous. Newspapers all across the country attacked Beard for making this argument, for basically trying to bring...
For 50 years.
Yeah, or longer. For basically deifying the founders, and it's actually in response to Beard's book that the term founding fathers is coined in 1915. By Warren G. Harding at the Republican National Convention. He's the first one to use that phrase, and part of it is in direct response to the controversy that Beard and progressives had set off. But it's this dichotomy that's created in the early 20th century between the idea that the revolution is unfinished, and that there is still and that the nation is still to be let's say perfected or improved, right? Versus this other more conservative vision of the memory of the revolution and of patriotism generally, which is much more celebratory and sort of more static approach to patriotism. And then that's the dichotomy then that lasts throughout the 20th century, really, and in a very real sense into the 21st century. Yeah.
And so 1917, Bolshevism, the Russian Revolution, that sort of
really spurs
things.
Yeah. So you have you have Beard and the progressives who are about trying to make change, and that puts conservatives in the early 20th century very much on edge. But it's really then the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. The Wall Street bombing, right? And one of the things that comes out of that I talk about in the book is Constitution Day. It comes specifically out of that context, these efforts to celebrate the Constitution and educate people about the Constitution in a very specific way. And of course, immigration is also driving, those anxieties there that a lot of people are feeling, especially elites, about that increased immigration meant, that the American character was being diluted, right? And they worried that these immigrants from the not best parts of Europe were bringing socialist ideas, right? And that was going to infect.
My Slovenian great-grandparents are listening.
Yeah. And so that's the concerns that people had that then drove this impulse to celebrate the revolution, in a very sort of critical, uncritical and sort of celebratory way, in response to these very real sort of material and political crises.
You have some interesting, I think really interesting information stories about the creation of heritage organizations, which are completely different now, I would say, in great fairness to them, have made a major transformation. The Daughters of the American Revolution, Sons of the American Revolution, etc. But yeah, could you talk a little bit about the creation and the activities in these years?
Yeah, they're founded in the 1890s, the Daughters of the American Revolution, the Sons of the American Revolution. And they are founded out of these anxieties, especially over immigration, right? And major parts of their mission when they were founded and their efforts throughout the 1890s, 1900s, all into the 20s and 30s was, a lot of public programming aimed at explaining, the meaning of the American Revolution and by extension what it meant to be an American to immigrants. And they held, classes in all major cities. They had, evening classes. They had programming for immigrant children, all kinds of things. They published their own guides to the Constitution in, dozens of languages. The really sort of impressive amount of outreach that they were doing. And then kind of what happens to them is, they sort of, those groups were so heavily politicized that they just become more and more political over time. By the 30s, the DAR and the SAR, are in some sense largely like anti-New Deal groups, and they become heavy and prominent anti-communist groups in the 1950s and 1960s. But then, of course, there was a radical change in the nation's historical consciousness around the long bicentennial era. And that had a huge impact on these organizations. And like you say, like they're completely different organizations now, than they used to be. But, like all institutions, they were a product of the times in which they arose.
Before we invite a few questions, I just want to sort of leap ahead a little bit to make sure we talk a little bit about the Bicentennial, of course, which is in the memory of many of us here in the room, I dare say, and actually we are on the site of the National Park Service Visitor Center built for the American Bicentennial, the Queen's Bell, which you have some wonderful anecdotes about, which was a gift to the nation from Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth in 1976. Actually, just was right outside the window here in a bell tower, like Rapunzel for nearly 50 years before she was liberated, and now marvelously reinstalled and on display just a block down 3rd Street from where we are in the Bicentennial Bell Garden, thanks to wonderful work by the Independence Park Trust. But anyway, what's going on in 1976?
There's actually, I think, a lot of sort of analogies between the Bicentennial and the 250th anniversary. There was in the 70s, because of Watergate, there's an unprecedented level of distrust among the public in government and in public institutions. Scandal-ridden presidency, right? Of course, economic uncertainty, right? And these are all circumstances that I've sort of found lead to more intense fights over the American Revolution. But these kinds of contexts, really shaped the Bicentennial I talk about in the book. But I think I grew up in the 80s, and I remember seeing vestiges of the Bicentennial when I was a kid. There were still fire hydrants painted, and things like that. Or you would go in people's houses and you would see, Bicentennial schlock, right, that people still had.
My children finally took to college just about 6-8 years ago what we referred to in the family as the Bicentennial couch, which was the red, white, and blue upholstered couch which had lived through my childhood, our family, then my house, raising the children, and then finally died a death as things do in fraternity and sorority houses in college. But
that's why I have a chapter in the book that's called "The Afterlife of the Bicentennial." Because the Bicentennial was not just 1 year. I actually talk about a long Bicentennial era, and the long Bicentennial era for me began with when 1776 opened on Broadway in 1969. Right, and in some sense, historians may look back and see the long 250th anniversary era as beginning with Hamilton opening on Broadway. Right? It's another similarity. And I think the thing about the Bicentennial that shocked me or surprised me a little bit was I had totally underestimated the Bicentennial. I thought it was, a sort of shallow patriotic celebration, like very commercial and all that. And it was that, for sure. But I didn't really realize the long-term significance of the Bicentennial. And that has to do, one, it's at the center of a real shift in the nation's racial historical consciousness. It really is, the Bicentennial is this sort of a fulcrum moment, right, where the kind of the efforts that we were talking about earlier about expanding the cast of characters and creating a more diverse memory of the revolution, really gains its sort of modern momentum, right, on the heels of the 1960s civil rights movements, of course. But so it's that radical change in the nation's historical consciousness around the Bicentennial that I was. That I didn't realize the extent of. And then the other thing is, how much the Bicentennial spurred the development of public history and historical sites in the United States. So much of the money that the federal government earmarked for grants and stuff like that around the Bicentennial, went to local groups and many historical sites, many African-American historical sites having to do with women's history. And so it's all of a piece, really, but that, there was a lot of money that was put in to the development of public history and historical sites. And at the same time, historians were increasingly starting to work at places like that, at historical sites, rather than just working in academia as faculty. And so these sort of latest developments in scholarship and we're coming to public historical sites much more rapidly than they ever had before.
Yeah, I think you do such a great job talking about the People's Bicentennial Commission and just really the sense that there were, people were at a very high level in public discourse. These arguments that go very deep to the beginning, but still were very much in the public eye.
Yeah, the People's Bicentennial Commission was a group that was founded by Jeremy Rifkin, who was a very left wing socialist, in the early 70s, and he was disillusioned by the new left, and he's so with the Bicentennial coming up, he created this People's Bicentennial Commission, which is typically called the PBC, and his goal was to create a sort of patriotic left group, and the main message was anti-corporate, anti-big business, and it's in the early 70s when the corporate growth and controls on corporations really starts to lessen during the Nixon administration, and so that is the main message that he is selling. And the thing of it is that the PBC, even though it's run by a bunch of socialists, and they're making this argument about anti-big business, and many Americans are amenable to that, and so that group became quite popular and circulated material all throughout the country. They gave guides for holding reading events and things like that. They circulated a ton of material, and it so much so. And they also staged massive protests at the anniversary of the Tea Party in '73, and then again of Concord in 1975. They held another big public rally, and they were so much in the sort of public consciousness that a number of conservative senators got really worried, and they actually held a series of hearings, that they called an attempt to steal the Bicentennial by this left-leaning group, But in some sense, it's really the one of the last expressions of a sort of patriotic left, right? Because after the Bicentennial, Ronald Reagan is a key figure at the end of the book because no president talked about the revolution more than Ronald Reagan, not even Abraham Lincoln. And so you end up, by the end of the 1980s, I think, with a lot of people have an assumption that that the revolution is something that is owned by conservative Republicans basically, and liberals and Democrats. Ever since the change in the nation's racial historical consciousness, it also complicated liberal politics in a sense because they were managing multiple constituencies, unlike the Republican Party. And so basically, the Democrats and left found it very hard to try to own the revolution, and essentially by the 90s kind of give up on doing that, right? And Obama is the one who really starts to do that again on the sort of Democratic liberal side. And it was one of the most shocking things was I read a lot of Ronald Reagan speeches for this book, and when I was reading Obama's speeches, especially from 2004 through to 2008, very similar to what Ronald Reagan was saying, right, in his speeches. And so, this split in between who owns the revolution, was really set by the 1980s, and it's really continued down almost to the present. Right. Yeah.
We were talking earlier that it's actually Obama almost was the burning out of a star in terms of the sort of liberal left. Yeah. Even making a pretense of wanting to own the revolution.
Yeah,
so
I mean, part of the reason that he felt compelled to do that and was correct in doing that was because of being the first African American candidate the second African American candidate for the presidency and the first American president. And so, he struck a much more patriotic tone than most Democrats, than any Democrats had for probably decades. And I think, a lot of Democrats were uncomfortable with the ways that he talked about the revolution in very sort of celebratory, and sort of laudable terms. And how that's going to play out up until, for this 250th, there's some sense that things are changing, I think, Yeah.
Well, we could sit here and talk all night. Jim Taub, are you our speaker runner tonight and proxy for our online crowd?
I am very privileged to be so, and I will say, just to make sure we have enough time for our book signing, we're going to have one question coming in from Zoom, and we have time for one lucky winner to give their question from the crowd as well. So Rachel on Zoom asks, what do you think of the 1619 Project?
Well, I did allude to this in the epilogue of the book. Yeah. I mean, the 1619 Project is an expression of a development of racial politics in the last part of the 2010s, right? That in a lot of ways is the sort of end of the Obama era racial politics. I always look back at the Hamilton musical as it's most fundamentally an expression of Obama era politics, right? With the immigration theme and all of that, and it's looks more like sounds more like the Obama era than it does about the American Revolution in some ways, right? And so the 1619 Project, there's a key thing that happens in between Hamilton and the 1619 Project, and that is the 2016 election, right? And the election of Donald Trump had a significant impact on the nation's racial politics, and it became and still remains the fact that the Obama era approach to racial politics, I think, is no longer deemed valid or even palatable by many Democrats around the left. So in some sense, the Hamilton musical is a sort of historical distillation of the Obama era and its racial politics, while then the 1619 Project is an expression of the post-Trump racial politics. But of course, it has it has scholarly roots that go back to the 60s and 70s, and so it too grows out of the this long tradition of expanding the cast of characters, but also expanding the role of slavery and understanding its place in American history. Yeah.
And we have time for
Who's our lucky winner?
Question. I've got to say, this gentleman's hand got up first.
Yeah, I'll say in a second is that when I talked before about how the impact of changing the starting date of the revolution can have an impact on the meaning that's conveyed. Of course, that's what the 1619 Project is trying to do. It's trying to create a new origin myth, right? That is rooted in 1619 and the arrival of the first African slaves. And I mean, I don't really have a judgment on that, but that's what the attempt. And you sometimes see that tried by Civil War historians when they call the Civil War the Second American Revolution, or So I see it in those terms. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you for coming, Michael. My question is internationally, and by the way, full disclosure, I'm about 100 pages into the book, so if you've addressed this and I waste this question, I apologize. But you started talking about it a little bit. For example, the French, the Russians, whoever, do they struggle with the memory of the revolution as much as Americans do? Or is this a uniquely American phenomenon?
Do they struggle with the memory of the American Revolution or their own revolutions?
Their own revolutions.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is something a bit unique about how Americans relate to the revolution. I think it is that emotional connection in some sense. I mean, I think the French are proud of the sort of historical.
They do not stress over what Charlemagne would have said about same-sex marriage or whatever,
or
right?
Pierre, for that matter, right? I think they have an admiration, a sort of historical admiration for those events, but I mean, 1789 is not really the founding of the modern French nation, right? In the way that the 1776 is for the United States. And I mean, I hate to sound like I'm making an exceptionalist argument here, but I think there is something a little bit unique and interesting about Americans' emotional connection to the memory of the revolution, right? You can have other connections to it. I think, the French and maybe certain Russians have, connections to the memory of their revolutions. But there is something very, I think, interesting and unique about the emotional connection that Americans have, and that's really the core thing I'm trying to get at in the book, is that is what the impact of that relationship is, that connection, how it's sort of played out in our politics and our culture over 250 years. So, yeah.
Well, Michael, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, everyone.
The book is The Memory of 76, and I hope all of you will, for those in the room, will purchase a copy, and those online will get a copy as well. Very important for the moment we're in as a nation. Thank you, and we'll see you at the next one.